It's 12 o'clock. Thank you to everyone who has joined us for today's Records Roundup, Researching with Tax Records. I'm going to turn off my video before we get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us again. My name is Stacy Hutchison, and today Maureen Plensky and I will be doing a deep dive into Chester County's tax records. Before we get started, I want to remind you that there's still time to join one of the Chester County History Center's upcoming underground walking tours, and this weekend's Lafayette's Ball. Finally, if you have any questions during the program, please put them in the chat box. As we begin the program, I would like to share a little bit about the Chester County Archives. The history of the Chester County Archives begins in 1982, the year of the county's tricentennial, when a partnership was established between the County of Chester and the Chester County Historical Society, which is now known as the Chester County History Center. The goal of this partnership was and continues to be to preserve and make available the historic records of the Chester County government. Currently located at the Government Services Center in Westchester, the Chester County Archives holds over 3,500 cubic feet of original public records, of which roughly 40% has been digitized. It is important to note that county records are collected and maintained following Pennsylvania state law, which means that county governments did not create or keep records unless mandated to do so. The Archives Records Guides and Indexes page is organized by subject headings where we have co-located related records. You can search indexes and access scans of these historic records right from the Archives website, and that includes today's subject, tax records. Maureen will be sharing about how to access the Archives records at the end of the program. Taxes are a part of our life just as they were for Chester Countyans in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. Tax records, like census records, situate a vast majority of individuals in a specific place at a specific time. But unlike federal census records, taxes were collected yearly, so they can be quite useful for researchers. However, to use tax records effectively, it is important to understand how taxes were assessed, the types of records created through the tax process, and who was being taxed. For today's program, I will be covering tax and tax-related records through 1799. Then I will turn the program over to Maureen, who will highlight records from the 19th century. Chester County maintained 3 series of tax records in the 18th century: provincial taxes, county taxes, and eventually state taxes. Within each series, the records are organized by year, and within each year, you may find different types of records produced through the taxation process: returns, assessments, discounts, and rates. Each of these specific records is tied to the taxation process itself and will provide varying degrees of information. To raise a tax, township constables or assessors were instructed to make lists of taxable inhabitants and their taxable wealth, and then return this information to the county's commissioners by a specific date. The commissioners and the assessors then met, rated, and assessed the inhabitants in each township. A list of the taxables in each township and the rates which they were to pay was prepared in duplicate, and one copy was sent to the township tax collector. Accompanying the list was a warrant instructing the tax collector to notify each person of his tax and the date set for appeals. After appeals were heard, A second set of rates was created, again in duplicate, and one copy was sent to the collector with a warrant ordering him to immediately collect the tax. The first series that I want to highlight is provincial taxes, which date from the time of William Penn and his founding of Pennsylvania as a British colony. At that time, Pennsylvania was officially known as the province of Pennsylvania, hence the use of the term provincial taxes. William Penn founded Chester County in 1682, and the originals of late 17th century taxes can be found at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. You can also find a reproduction of Chester County's 1693 provincial taxes in Futhy and Cope's History of Chester County, as you see here. The earliest tax record held at the archives is a provincial tax from 1715. On the right is the tax rate for Kennett Township. Each digitized tax record will have a title page which identifies the name of the tax, the law by which the tax was levied, and the timeline for the tax's collection. The title page also identifies the assigned record number of P1 and is the reference you will find in tax indexes. The P tells you that this was a provincial tax. As you see, a tax rate is simply a list of names with the amount of tax to be paid. As a British colony, the columns shown here refer to pounds, shillings, and pence. All tax records at the archives before 1765 are tax rates, with one exception. The archives has a single township's return, and it's the 1726 county tax return for Thornbury Township. As a county tax, you see on the titled page that it has been labeled C8, C for county. As you will notice, a return is much more informative than the Kennett's rates from the last slide. In addition to the list of the township's inhabitants, the columns indicate how many acres of rough land and sown land, the number of horses, cows, young cattle, colts, and sheep, as well as other assets like George Pierce's partial ownership of Samuel Gilpin's mill, and whether or not servants were employed. At the very bottom, there is a section with two headings, single men and inmate. As you saw on the Thornbury return, there were three different lists of a township's inhabitants, and raises the question, who was taxable? The first category is landholders or occupiers. It is important to note that the term used is landholder and not landowner, because the tax was assessed to the person who occupied the property. If you were not a landholder and were male over the age of 21, then you were assessed a head tax or a poll tax. Your rate was determined by your marital status. If you were married or widowed, you were referred to as an inmate. And if you were single, you were a freeman. Persons of color and women were generally not taxable inhabitants. However, you will likely find that if a free Black man owned land, he would be included, and a widowed or single women who had owned land or had money out at interest were taxed. Although researchers may find inconsistencies in these records, understanding these tax categories may enable you to use tax records to narrow down a birth date or even estimate a marriage date. This is the 1757 tax rate for East Nottingham Township and clearly illustrates the different categories that I just mentioned. The first column lists landholders. The second column lists inmates. And the third column lists freemen. You can also observe that the tax rate for inmates was consistently less than that for freemen, so there was a financial inducement to marry. Before moving forward, I want to point out that Chester County is the parent county to several neighboring counties, including present-day Lancaster County, which was established in 1729, and Delaware County, which was formed in 1789. Berks County was formed from Lancaster County in 1752. So in these early tax records, you will find townships that are no longer a part of Chester County today. You may have gathered that taxes were collected at the township level, and therefore the records themselves are organized by township. So having an understanding of the creation of townships is another important factor when searching for your ancestors in tax records, especially if a tax year has yet to be indexed. Pictured here is a resource which you can find on our website that traces the development of townships in Chester County. Especially useful are the last two columns, which identify parent and child relationships between townships. You can access both the township maps and the table from the previous two slides on the Archives Records, Guides, and Indexes page, and by clicking on the Township and Borough Boundaries hyperlink. So far, I have shared examples of a tax rate and a tax return. Another type of record produced through the taxation process is the assessment. You can see from this page of the 1799 county assessment that the residents of West Bradford were not only listed as in the rates and return that we've already seen, but they were assessed for their property, including the size of a property, a description of the type of dwelling, as well as any outbuildings. This assessor also recorded some additional information along with the assessment. We learn that Samuel Haynes owned woodland in West Bradford, but lived in East Calne, so he was a non-resident landowner. We see that the assessor observed Hugh Kurgan to be old and poor. Daniel Leonard's occupation of carpenter was noted, and Thomas Liggett was a tenant, not an owner of the 200 acres and middling stone house without a barn for which he paid tax. The notation of old and poor next to Hugh Kurgan was made to account for a reduction in taxable value, in other words, a discount. In addition to the provincial and county taxes, the third series of tax records is state taxes. There is no difference between a provincial and state tax, except for the change in the form of government because of the American Revolution. Shown here is the West Bradford assessment that was ordered in 1777 to raise £200,000 for the defense of the state. Not only do we see Daniel Leonard again, but there is a notation that James Marshall had been plundered by the British. This graphic illustrates the years of surviving tax records in the three separate series that I have mentioned. In addition to provincial, county, and state taxes, researchers can discover additional information by exploring complementary records such as provincial tax minutes, tax discounts or abatements, as well as federal taxes. Provincial tax minutes documented the process of laying the yearly provincial tax and included information related to the collection of taxes. In addition to identifying which commissioners and county assessors were present at a meeting, the minutes include details about payment for services, appeals, discounts, and abatements. Often, there is an explanation as to why a discount was ordered, like William Matthews' long-time incarceration. Robert Orr was poor and unable to pay. Thomas Hayes had enlisted and was gone. Benjamin House did not appear to be 21 years old. John Abram Letinus a priest had removed to the Jerseys, and finally that Owen Sullivan had gone a privateering. These entries show that you may be able to learn something totally unexpected about an ancestor in these records. If you would like to explore them, the provincial tax minutes have been both indexed and digitized and can be accessed through the links on our website. Similar to the provincial tax minutes, tax discounts also document abatements, but for county taxes. Early tax discounts were recorded through commissioners' minutes and pay orders from 1740 to 1803. The minutes are the official record of the county's administrative and financial business that was discussed and carried out at the commissioners' meetings. Commissioners' minutes can be quite detailed. This is the August 31st, 1775 entry in the earliest book of commissioners' minutes, and it outlines the county commissioner's instructions to the county treasurer to discount the Euclid Township tax collector because Reuben Hall and others were mostly gone, and for Thomas Martin, who had suffered loss by fire. A later series of county discounts begins in 1785 and continues into the 19th century. Shown here is the 1789 tax discount for London Grove Township and records discounts for William Reeve and David Flower for being poor, and James Poland and Henry McClurky because they've gone off. There is one other discounted list on this page, which is specific to this time period when residents were assessed a luxury tax for a pleasure carriage. Here we see a discount given for carriages that were observed to be broken and old. Finally, I want to draw your attention to the assessed amounts. Even in 1789, taxes were still being reckoned in pounds, shillings, and pence. It wasn't until the Coinage Act of 1792 that the dollar was established as the United States standard unit of currency. Like the Coinage Act, the 1798 federal direct tax affected Chester County residents. In 1798, rising tensions between the United States and France led many to believe that war was imminent. So Congress passed a direct tax to raise $2 million to support the country's military expansion. Each state was responsible for creating standardized forms to assess real estate, count enslaved individuals, and collect the state's share of the tax. Also known as the glass tax or the window pane tax, this federal tax has become a rich resource for researchers to provide insights into life in the late 18th century. These are federal records and are held by the National Archives. However, the Archives Research Room does have a microfilm copy of the 1798 direct tax. Unfortunately, much of Chester County's records have not survived. Only those townships which are starred on this map. So how do we take all of this information about taxes and use them in our research? You may remember the sad case of Thomas Martin from a few slides ago, whose taxes were discounted because he suffered loss due to fire. I traced his tax history to show how these records can work together. He first appears in the 1747-48 tax record as a freeman. Remembering that a freeman is defined as an unmarried man who is at least 21 years old, we might be able to estimate a birth year of 1726 to 27. In 1751, Thomas is taxed as an inmate for the first time, which points to a marriage in 1750 or early 1751. For the next 15 years, Thomas was taxed as both an occupier and as an inmate, which may point to fluctuating financial circumstances. In 1765, the provincial tax identifies Thomas as an occupier of 113 acres with horses and cows and identifies his occupation as a weaver. From 1770 to 1787, Thomas Martin continues as an occupier. Generally, the acreage remains consistent, and he continues to be taxed for livestock, including horses, cows, and sheep. However, in 1775, he took on an additional 10 acres of land, but the fire, as recorded in the discounts, must have set him back financially because the next tax shows that he was again taxed for 120 acres. In 1778, the first state tax, he is identified as a weaver again. You may also notice that the specificity of information captured in an assessment is largely dependent on the tax assessor's attention to detail. You can see in 1781 that this year's assessor specified that the cows and cattle were actually 5-horned cattle. In 1787, Thomas Martin disappears from the tax records entirely, but a John Martin appears. Could this be an indication of Thomas Martin's death and the name of Thomas's son? Absolutely. Chester County's wills and administration records confirm Thomas Martin's death in 1787 and that he had a son named John. One last resource that may help you to tie people to the tax record, people in the tax records with specific places are maps. This is the Archive 1777 Property Atlas, which shows that Thomas Martin and where his property is located in Euclid Township. In addition to learning about where Thomas Martin lived in Euclid Township, we can also learn about who and what were on the property through the 1783 state tax, which includes a return with a census. Here is Thomas Martin with 120 acres, 1 dwelling house, 2 outbuildings, and 9 white inhabitants living on the property, none of whom are servants. If we jump forward 12 years after Thomas's death, his son John is still living on the property. The 1799 county tax shows that there are now 2 stone dwellings, a stone spring house, and a log barn. The word tax may evoke images of IRS forms and TurboTax submittals, but I hope that you can see how very personal the tax process was for Chester Countyans in the 17th and 18th centuries. The terms and the tax collection process that was established in the 18th century continues into the next century, which Maureen will cover next. So bear with us as I stop sharing my screen and she begins.
Thank you, Stacy. I'll share my screen now. Okay, so as Stacy mentioned, I'll be discussing tax records in the 19th century. So taxes in the 18th century or 1800s followed the same system that Stacy mentioned. The tax assessor assessed a property, returned this information to the county commissioners, and then levied a tax rate. But as we will see, throughout the 1800s, tax assessors were responsible for recording much more than just taxes. And also taxes for this time period also tend to include more detail about a resident's property. Taxes on a basic level listed an ancestor's place of residence and the value of their property, but they may also provide a glimpse into their daily lives. Assessors recorded occupations, businesses, and key details about a property, such as acreage and livestock. So this is the 1838 tax record for Rebecca Lukens, who is known as the nation's first female industrialist. Women generally did not own property unless it was inherited from a husband or male family member. And Rebecca herself, she inherited this property from her deceased husband, Charles Lukens. As we can see from the tax record, Rebecca held 95 acres of land in East Cowan Township, along with a nail and rolling mill, one building valued at $1,800, and a decent amount of livestock. Rebecca Lukens was among the wealthiest residents of 19th century Chester County. Her property was valued at $7,625, which in today's money, that equals to over $250,000. But taxes, thankfully, are one of the few government records that apply to those of all wealth brackets. So whether someone owned 100 acres, 1 acre, or they didn't have any land at all, they still paid a tax. Residents who did not own any land were taxed as an inmate or a freeman. And as Stacy mentioned earlier, freemen were single men who owned no land, and inmates were married men who owned no land. Inmates and freemen were primarily taxed for their occupations, and this is the 1805 tax record for West Bradford, which shows that Richard Buffington labored as a mason, Joseph and Samuel Davis worked as shoemakers, and Isaac Hawley was employed as a carpenter. In addition to assessing residents' real estate, tax assessors also taxed residents' personal property. In 1831, the Pennsylvania General Assembly passed an act that required county assessors to make out a full statement of residents' intangible assets, such as mortgage notes, stocks, and bonds, along with luxury items, which in the early 1800s, that included pleasure carriages. As you are searching for ancestors in the tax records, it is important to note that taxes are organized alphabetically by township. The only exception are those townships that start with directions, so east, west, north, or south. For example, East Goshen is listed with townships that begin with the letter G. And within each township, residents are listed alphabetically. Landholders are listed before the inmates and freemen. So if you know where your ancestor resided within the county, even if these tax records are not indexed, you may be able to easily locate them within the tax record. You may also, of course, use our indexes to search for residents in tax records. These are available on our website, but as you may notice, there are noticeable gaps. The indexes skip from 1824 to 1838 to 1866. Researchers may still access some of these tax records for the intervening years through our digital collection site. You can access our digital collection site by clicking the Digitized Records tab and clicking the County Taxes link listed below. If you would like to access a tax record that is not yet available on our digital collections, you may contact our archives to request a copy. There is again a gap in the tax records in the mid-1800s. We do hold these in our physical collections. We just haven't digitized these records yet. So the process of tax assessments changed slightly in the 19th century. In 1799, assessors no longer assessed property yearly. They instead conducted a new assessment every 3 years. If a property was altered in the intervening years, say a new house was built, the taxes may not reflect this change until the next assessment. Taxes were only adjusted during these intervening years if a property was destroyed by a fire or other natural disaster. For instance, this tax record from 1801 shows that John Scott's house in Willistown burnt down. This assessment system continued into the 20th century. Taxes may also be used to determine when a resident built a home, transferred their property, married, or died. Perhaps you see an ancestor appear in the taxes one year, but they disappear the next. Or you see that the value of a property doubles. These small clues may reveal important moments in a person's life. Since assessors tax the landholder, you may see property change hands through the taxes. In 1793, William Major, who owned 10 acres in Willistown, passed away. He died without a will, which would have revealed who inherited this land. Taxes, however, give us an answer. Robert Major owned this plot until 1800, at which point the land was transferred to Elizabeth Major. In the 1822 tax record, Elizabeth Major's name is crossed out and replaced by Kentworthy Major, who was her son. Kentworthy held this land until 1833, when it was transferred to another Robert Major. Further complicating matters, the Majors never recorded a deed for this property. So if you were trying to determine who owned or occupied a certain piece of land, taxes may be a helpful resource. If you see that the tax rate jumps significantly from one year to the next, this may suggest that a new structure was built on the property. William J. Elliott, for instance, purchased a half-acre in Schuylkill Township in 1897. In the deed, the property was described as a plot of land, but when William passed away in 1930, there was a messuage or dwelling house on the property. This is the 1933 Atlas of Schuylkill Township, which shows a brick house on the property. The 1911 tax is the first record that identifies a house on the land. As Stacy mentioned earlier, if you see a resident's status change from freeman to inmate in the tax record, this indicates that they married between assessments. For instance, Philip Turner of East Bradford was taxed as a freeman in 1801 and as an inmate in 1802. Considering that the state did not require counties to record marriages until the 1880s, taxes may help researchers determine when their ancestor married. Disappearances from the tax record may also indicate that a resident passed away. Dennis Morin, for instance, was a laborer from East Whiteland. We do not have any death records, wills, or coroner records that revealed the date of his death, but he appeared as an inmate in the 1876 tax record and disappeared from the tax record completely in 1877. The taxes give us a date to search for other records, and an article published in the Daily Local News confirmed that he died in a quarry accident in July 1877. Depending on their circumstances, residents often received a discount on their taxes from the county commissioners. Residents were often granted a discount because they moved, married, or passed away. As Stacy mentioned, early tax discounts were recorded through commissioners' minutes and pay orders. From 1850 to 1865, discounts were recorded in exoneration books, which researchers may search through our online index. Discounts may reveal key information about a resident's life. Howell Kirk had a home in Maryland. Jacob Huss left the township, and Joseph Woods was insolvent. All received a discount. As you look for ancestors in the tax records, it's also important to keep in mind that townships and boroughs continued to form throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. In this map, townships marked green were established in the 1800s, and those marked yellow were established in the 1900s. So for instance, in 1844, the township of Brandywine was split into East and West Brandywine. So if you do not see an ancestor in one township, they may be listed under a newly formed township. And you can see when a township or borough formed by looking at that index that Stacy mentioned. Assessors were not only responsible for taxes. Throughout the 19th century, the Pennsylvania General Assembly also required assessors to record detailed information about their township's residents. Including the septennial census. So in 1790, the state constitution required that an enumeration of taxable inhabitants shall be made every 7 years. And taxable inhabitants included men who were over 21 years old or women who owned property. Before 1848, before the 1848 Married Women's Property Act was passed, only widowed or single women could own property. And it was important for the legislature to determine how many taxable inhabitants resided in the county, since the population determined the number of senators and representatives. So the tax assessor listed the name of each resident along with the township where they resided and their occupation. This collection may be a useful tool to trace how certain industries developed across the county. And for instance, this is the 1870 septennial census for the borough of Oxford. There were a range of occupations identified, including bricklayers and masons, farmers, carpenters, and railroad workers. In 1800, the legislature also required that enslaved people be identified in the census. Initially, enslaved people were listed separately, but after 1814, they were listed at the end of each township census. Assessors recorded the name, age, gender, and race of each enslaved person in their township. Because the state legislature passed the Gradual Abolition Act in 1780, few people were enslaved for life in Pennsylvania by the early 1800s. According to this census from 1821, Deborah Flowers, a 40-year-old Black woman, was enslaved by Joseph Bowen. Taxes revealed that Deborah was still enslaved by the Bowens by 1824. She was listed as an enslaved person aged about 50 in the tax record for Jane Bowen. Additional laws passed by the Pennsylvania legislature in the 1820s and 30s also required assessors to record those who were deemed deaf and blind in the septennial census. And the septennial census was maintained by the county until 1863. In 1809, the Pennsylvania General Assembly passed an act to provide for the education of the poor, which required assessors to identify young children, so that was 5 to 12 years old, whose parents could not pay for their schooling. Assessors listed these children at the end of each township's assessment. If deemed eligible, the children were entitled to free schooling at the county's expense. The 1809 Act was rendered obsolete in 1834 when the General Assembly passed the Public Education Act, which funded the establishment of free public schools. The county, however, continued to pay for the schooling of poor children until 1837. This collection is especially helpful for genealogists since the tax assessor identified the parents of these children along with the ages of each child. You may find whether a resident was listed in the poor school children records by searching our online indexes. The index is listed under the Poorhouse and Pauper Records link. And if a child was deemed eligible for free schooling, they were also listed in the Commissioners and Treasurers books. So this index includes all three record groups. From 1893 to 1906, tax assessors also compiled birth and death information, which was then turned into the county. The birth and death registers were not always complete or very accurate. Oftentimes, a birth or death was recorded 6 months to a year after the actual event. So tax assessors recorded information about the child, including their name, gender, race, birthplace, and birth date. Parents are also listed in the birth register. As I mentioned earlier, the date of record, that is the date when this information was recorded, often came months after the actual birth. For instance, Smedley Edwin was born in November 1893, but his birth was not recorded until August of 1894. Deaths were also recorded by the assessor from 1893 to 1906. If a resident passed while they were still a minor, that is when they were under 21, then their parents were listed in the register. After 1906, the state of Pennsylvania began to issue birth and death certificates, so that would be held by the state archives. And you can also find the indexes for birth and death records on our records, guides, and indexes page. Across the centuries, tax assessors recorded detailed information about the residents within their township. As Stacy mentioned, assessors in the 1700s maintained county, provincial, and state taxes. Before 1765, the county taxes only include the rate, which was the total tax a resident was to pay. By the late 18th century and into the 19th century, the role of the assessor expanded. They are also tasked with maintaining the septennial census, poor school children records, and the birth and death registers. And as you can see from this timeline, our collections do include county taxes into the 20th century. We hold taxes up to 1940 in our physical collections, but we have only digitized up to 1900. But if you would like to access a tax record that is not yet digitized, you can visit our research room or contact us at the archives directly. The archives is open for walk-ins Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Please feel free to call, stop by, or email us. We also offer a virtual reference option, Ask an Archivist, which is a 30-minute reference consultation with either me or Stacy. So thank you so much for coming and watching our presentation. Now we are open to any questions. Show my video. So I see one when other counties in Pennsylvania have similar records. I can speak. I know Delaware County has similar records, and all of our records are limited to county government. Um, so if they do have generally that information is held by the county government archive if they have one. I know Delaware County does.
Yeah, I'll chime in too. The so all of these records are organized by Pennsylvania state law, so they would have had to collect them. Whether they still exist or they've survived is the question. One of the reasons
Mhm.
why the rates have lasted so long is because that was the final step in the process, that second set of rates. And so those were what were used to actually collect the tax. Therefore, that's what was kept. And so the earlier records, that's why you wouldn't see as many assessments or returns and so forth. Um, okay, Daniel asks, did Chester County continue to track taxes after 1789 for Chester County townships who were annexed to the new county? So that's a very clear no. We have people from those um, child townships coming back to access their original records. But then they would certainly, that would be held by the present day county. So if it was a Thornbury Township that went to Delaware County, then you'll want to check with Delaware County and so forth. You're welcome. Catherine, charged in West Bradford, but is living in Maryland. Abner Cat. Catherine, it may be worth reaching out to us. It sounds like this is pretty detailed and a specific example. When I see Abner Cloud's estate, that typically indicates that he had passed. And so it was whatever was there. So we can certainly do some research on that particular situation. For those who did not, I think you had asked earlier, they may begin to put levies on the property, and then it may eventually go to an inquisition and execution process. So they could potentially lose the land if people did not pay the tax. So, but it may also, if he was poor enough, there may be discounts to explain why the commissioners could have allowed a discount or an abatement so that he wasn't on the hook for that. So there may be some further records that we can consult for the Abner Cloud family. Are there any other questions? I can see. I did put in the chat box that there is a brief survey. If you would please fill that out. We would appreciate it. It helps us to plan for future programs. And then there's another question, would a church, if also used as a schoolhouse, be taxed? Gosh, those early records for churches, they're not even showing up in the taxes. If it's the crossover time, I don't generally, I've never seen a school in taxes. Personally, I think that the let's see here. I think
Yeah,
that go ahead, were you going to say something?
I was gonna oftentimes, like if a property was owned by trustees, including a schoolhouse, it could be listed under the trustee's name, but same as you, Stacy, I haven't seen a schoolhouse um, listed within itself within a tax record.
So we have a question, was a property sheriff sale required for a death with no relatives or taxes owed. So that is probably a whole nother program on inquisitions and executions,
Mhm.
which is a whole process that the county had established to if there was debt owed. And so that could have happened. Typically, what would happen is it would have been if someone died, there would have been an administrator, and then they would have sold to the property to satisfy the debts, is typically how I see that happening. If the court had to, they would have appointed an administrator. We have a program on our YouTube channel that is all about probate. And so that might be a very good resource. It is available, I believe, up on our YouTube channel. And if it's not, email us and we can send you a link. Yes, this program, we will send a link to this program once we get it downloaded from the cloud this afternoon. So, and it will be on our YouTube, posted to our YouTube channel and available for you. We do have a YouTube channel. The icon is right on our homepage. Okay, well, we really appreciate your taking your time during your lunch hour today. If you have any further questions or want to follow up with us, as Maureen said, you can email us, you can call us, you can set up a virtual reference appointment with us on Tuesdays. And that, again, is the Ask an Archivist button on our website. But otherwise, thank you so very much for joining us, and we hope to hear from you soon. All right, thank you.